Well, I think our community has to understand what's been going on in our city. And if we do and have understood what has been happening in our city for the last couple of months, I don't know that we would be so surprised about what happened in Washington, D.C. I mean, clearly, I think we were all shocked that they were able to get inside the Capitol, but we wouldn't be surprised about the groups showing up to that magnitude and those ideologies and their intent, because they've been doing some of those same things here in Sacramento for the last 2 months. And I think we really need to understand why we have groups in our country that um, are that radicalized that they're willing to do those sort of things. And then obviously we have other groups that protest in our streets for any number of things. But for the last couple of years, essentially there's groups protesting for equity and changes in law enforcement and some of the things that we've seen across our country. And I think we need to understand why those groups are doing that in our streets too. And we can keep dealing with the protests. We can keep trying to ensure that the protests don't get out of hand and don't hurt people and don't damage our property. But unless we start dealing with, in our country, that is, unless we start dealing with the root and the cause, we're going to continue to see either these extremist groups that often have white supremacist or white nationalist ideologies, and we're going to continue to see other groups protest in our street for equity and for us to, live up to the words in our Constitution. Um, we have to address those issues of difference and race in our country, and that's what's driving this stuff. And if we don't, we're going to continue to see it.
Well, I know one of the things that you were saying is you think it's time to just address this head on, and that there are some examples you want to share with folks tonight.
Yeah, I mean, some of them are protest related, and some of them just go to the heart of the challenge that we have in our country. We just recently had a horrific shooting at the mall where two young black kids were shot by another young black kid. And when I read the news articles and social media, I read comments like, that's what savages do. I read comments like, that's the black community. I read comments that said, that's what happens when you don't have parents. Not only is none of that true, but if you go back a couple months before that to Kyle Rittenhouse, who drove from Illinois to Wisconsin, he was 17, white guy, killed two people in a protest. Did we say those same things about him? No. We said he's misunderstood, was bullied in school. Then we raised $2 million to get him out of bail. And just this last week, I read an article where he was in a bar with a group of Proud Boys, one of the same groups that's protesting on our streets every Saturday and being very violent, throwing up white power hand signs. So why do we think and talk about a double homicide so differently based on who was involved? And then I think it wasn't that long ago that the protests, among many things, but the protests regarding George Floyd, Stephon Clark, not only happened across the country, but here in Sacramento. And we had people that talked about those protests as these savages in our streets. We need to get them out of our streets. They called for me and the police department to take more stronger action. They called for consequences and overwhelming force. They called for all sorts of things. Those folks are mysteriously silent over the last 2 months when it's Proud Boys, among others, in our streets. So why do we respond so differently depending on what group is in our streets? So for me, I'm not real thrilled about any group that's claiming, white supremacist ideologies, or, the Southern Poverty Law Center lists the Proud Boys as a hate group. I mean, I'm not real thrilled about that in my city either as a black man. But I'm also not thrilled about, regardless of what your ideology is, you committing violence in our city and you causing harm in our city, regardless of what your ideology is, we should be against that altogether. And so, you know, we're just going to continue to see these radical groups doing radical things in our community unless we as a country decide that we're going to tackle this issue head on.
And sounds like what you're
Um,
saying, unless we decide we're going to tackle systemic racism.
Absolutely. And our history. I mean, I can't tell, in some of the earlier protests, as you know, I wrote a couple op-eds and I basically talked about this topic. Can't tell you how many letters I've received, how many emails I received, how many posts on social media that said, we don't have to worry about those things on the West Coast. We don't have to worry about those things in California because we didn't have slavery. We were a free state. Redlining was a long time ago. Jim Crow wasn't here. It wasn't a long time ago. It was in the South. All that's untrue. It was all here. We had redlining. We had Jim Crow. We had slaves. And they impact us to this day. And we're like in denial. Like we want to act like that never happened. And so but there's a reason why we call the kids in the mall savages. If you knew our history, you would know why we call the black kids savages and the white kid in Wisconsin somebody that was bullied in school and had a troubled childhood. And so, one of my questions would be to all of us to really think about is and a lot of it's not even conscious. A lot of it's implicit, bias, subconscious, unconscious. But if you regard a certain group of people as savages, even if it's subconscious or implicit, what do you do with savages? How do you interact or deal with savages? It's quite different than you deal with somebody that you think had a troubled childhood or maybe was bullied in school. And so we have to deal with that in this country. We really do, and we rarely do. And so we can continue to deal with the condition, which is these protests. We can continue to put officers in our community in the middle of the crossfire of these radicalized groups that are fighting each other in our streets every day. I mean, just look at social media. They threaten each other all the time on social media, and then they brag about the damage that they did in our city. I take that personal. This is my city. And the people that wear the uniform that I wear and the people that live in this community, our charge is to keep our community safe. These folks are bragging about it. These folks tell us before they're going to do it that they're going to do it. And so we have to deal with what creates the environment that allows so many people, thousands of people a few weeks ago in Washington, D.C., to literally storm our United States Capitol. And oftentimes we call them patriots. We call them patriots. And they just broke into the Capitol. Now, when there was people in Sacramento blocking the streets, calling for law enforcement reform, calling for equity, and yeah, sometimes those became violent. There's a few notable times where there was extreme violence in regards to some of those. Early on in the George Floyd protests comes to mind. But if you look out over the last couple of years, for the most part, they were disruptive, they were vocal, but they weren't violent, and they weren't tearing up our city. And how did we respond to them? The things we said about them? It's quite different than some people are saying about what happened in DC. So I think we need to reconcile with all that. And being the day after Martin Luther King's celebration, where we all were posting quotes and lofty goals and things from Martin Luther King just a day ago, it might be time to quit talking about it and be about it.
Well, talk about that. I mean, some of the things that are going to come up at tonight's meeting. Do you know of any officers, your officers, that may have attended that U.S. Capitol protest or whatever you want to call it in D.C.? Have you been able to identify anyone from the Sacramento Police Department who traveled to D.C.?
Yeah, as far as we know right now, the answer to that is no. We don't know of any officers and from the Sacramento Police Department that were there. And judging by how much that video is being gone over at every level of government, I think there's a high likelihood we would know by now if we did. But in the event that we ever find out that we have any officers from our department that were in DC and they illegally stepped a foot inside that Capitol, I'll terminate them. That's not what we expect out of a police officer.
Well, and talk to me also, Chief, about some of the things that we're hearing happening even today. You know, we've got the National Guard here in the city. We've got the National Guard in our nation's capital. There are some reports as well about the Sacramento Police Department conducting raids just today, making arrests of people known to be a part of groups like Antifa. Can you shed any light on some of the steps that are being done even today to try to prevent some of the things that we've seen in the nation's capital and right here in the state capitol?
Yeah, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail of our plans on how we are planning on preventing any destruction or violence in our city. But suffice to say, we have a lot of personnel, not only from our department, but other law enforcement agencies, Highway Patrol, National Guard, deployed in our city. And that's how serious we're taking this. And that's how the potential threat to our city, how high of a threat that is. Now, I've said from the beginning, for months, that you participate in a protest, that's one thing. That's your constitutionally protected rights. And the Sacramento Police Department takes that very seriously and will protect those rights to the best of our ability. But if you come to our city and commit violence, you come to our city and conduct destruction upon our homes and our businesses and people's livelihoods, if we can have you identified, we will arrest you. So that's what's going on. As we are able to get people identified, we will make those arrests. So we've made a few arrests.
So what you're saying is these things are ongoing, that your work is ongoing, that you're doing the best you can to identify those who have been coming out to these weekly, weekend protests and make arrests to ensure that this doesn't continue.
Yeah, I mean, during the actual unrest in our cities, when they get violent or destructive, our incident commanders, our leaders in the field have to make a decision at that time. Where are we going to place our officers? What's the threat? What's the consequences if we insert officers into a crowd that's wearing helmets, bulletproof vests, weapons, swords, liquids? And so we've made a few arrests during the protests. That's one of the things that some have criticized us on, thought we should be more forceful and make an attempt to make more arrests. But we have to think about our people and our community and the protesters' safety, quite frankly. And we make those decisions as we go, the best decisions we can at the time. But just because we don't arrest you at the scene when you're actually committing the crime does not mean that we won't arrest you later if we can have you identified. And so, yes, that's ongoing. I've said it from the beginning. We will continue to do that. Anytime we can identify somebody that has committed one of those type of crimes in our city, we will arrest you.
And it's not just Antifa, Chief. It's not just Antifa. You're saying anyone, Proud Boys, Antifa, any of these groups that might be coming out doing these things.
Yeah, it doesn't matter your ideology. It matters what you do. So it matters what you do in this city. You try to destroy our city. You try to inflict harm upon another person in our city. It doesn't matter what you believe in. It matters that that's what you did, the act that you did. And so we will arrest you regardless of which side you're on, what's your ideology. You can come. It's one thing if you want to come here and you have an ideology that most people don't agree with, that I don't agree with, but if you do it peacefully, then we will protect that right. That is a constitutionally protected right, and we will protect your right to do that, regardless how much we don't agree and don't appreciate your beliefs. But that's not what's been happening. People have been committing violence. People have been violent towards the other group. People have been violent against some of our residents in the city, and people have been violent against people in the media. And so if we can identify them after the fact, if we don't arrest them at the time, we will make an arrest.
Final words, Chief. I know one of the other things expected to come up is things like alleging officers saying things like "we stand with the Proud Boys" and videos allegedly going around on social media. What can you tell us about those alleged videos?
Well, I think that's why our primary news sources, which, over time that's changing with social media and all that, but still our primary news sources are like you and our news stations and our newspapers. And unfortunately, those primary news sources have not covered these incidents of unrest over the last couple months. And when that occurs, it leaves a lot of room for other people to cover it themselves on social media, whether it's groups or individuals. And those groups are not always held to the standards that you are held to. Those groups are not always held to the standards that Channel 10 is held to, whether it's through your education or your station's, rules and standards that they hold you to. And so what we've seen is a lot of either untruths, flat out lies, or not telling the whole story. And so, for example, one of those incidents, there was a widespread on social media, a video, pretty contentious scene. And you hear somebody say, "I have your six," which means I have your back. And it was written down at whoever posted it wrote at the bottom, like closed caption, the words, and they said that the Sacramento police officer said that to the Proud Boys. And that's proof that the police department supports this radical group in the Proud Boys. Now, it's interesting, both groups say the same thing about the police department. But so as you know, we have body cameras. So we researched that. It's actually a flat out lie. The person that said it was the Proud Boys said it to the officers that were intent on staying in the middle of these two groups that were trying to assault each other. So you have somebody that posts on social media that trying to convince people that the police department is supporting one group or the other, and in this case, the Proud Boys, when in fact it's the Proud Boys that says it to an officer that they don't even know. These officers are in the middle trying to stop people. And so you create this environment where people start thinking that the police department is not this independent arbiter or this independent group trying to keep our city safe. Instead, you can start getting people to believe that we are on one side or the other. We're on Sacramento's side. We're on the side of safety. We're on the side of people, keeping people from harm's way. We're on the side of our businesses and our residents not having their homes burnt down and damaged. That's whose side we're on.
Chief, I cannot thank you enough for making time for us to be able to go through some of these things. Anything that I have not asked you that you want to share with our audience tonight?
No, not, I've been here all my whole life in Sacramento. And I've been part of this police department since I was 19 years old. I have every bit of faith in this city and in this department. But I also know it can't just be this department working on it. We not only provide training to deal with the protests, whether it's crowd control training, providing our officers with equipment, protective equipment, whether it's helmets or shields, provide our leaders with incident command training, but we also deal with the root and the cause, which is we provide our officers with implicit bias training, history's relationship on today. We invite Stanford University, Washington State, Center for Policing Equity, Department of Justice, American Leadership Forum, all into our department to examine those issues and come back with recommendations so we can also deal with the cause and the root of what ails us as a country. But we can't just do it as a police department. We're not perfect. We have improvement to be made. I make mistakes. Our department makes mistakes. But we are working on both the root and the condition. But if all it is the police department, we need to do it as a country. Because we're going to continue to see these radical groups rise and be more violent and take to our streets and cause what we see this whole week. We can't, I don't know anybody that wants to live like this. The National Guard on our streets, law enforcement agencies from all over our region, protecting buildings, protecting people. We can't continue to do this. I can't continue to put our personnel through this. This is not sustainable. So, you know, it's time to do something about it.
This is not sustainable. Not sustainable, you're saying. Something has to be done, and we thank you for beginning the conversation with us. I'm hearing you say that you believe at the root of all of this is addressing race.
Well, race and other differences, right? So, I mean, like I told you earlier, when we say derogatory terms about people that take to our streets in anger, that isn't typically violent. There's, like I said, there was some violence from time to time, but typically they're complaining and want change to law enforcement.